Hello, this is Ray Bustos. In this series, Anatomy of the Masters, we're going to be viewing a bunch of images through the ages. We're going to pick a few exemplary people, in this case 12 or 13, from the 1500s all the way through the 19th century. In this series, what we're going to do is explore how different artists have taken that same knowledge and making it their own personal statement. It's an amazing experience, and I hope that you enjoy this. In this case, I have Bernini, and in his anatomy, what I'm picking from this particular image is the leg. And one of the main things that I do is I look for bony landmarks. So for instance, in this case, I'm looking at this area here, and I could see that this is where the head of the fibula is. If you feel on the side of your knee, you'll feel that knobby bone. That's the fibula. If you want to know where it ends up, that's pretty easy because it ends up being the lateral malleolus, which actually means hammer, and it's your ankle. So basically, from this little circle up here to the very top, those are the only 2 points that you're going to see that bone. The bone itself is at the thinner of the two bones in your leg. And leg refers to from the area at your knee down to your foot. Kind of like a chicken. In this case, this area up here is not the leg, that's the thigh. See what I mean? So what we're going to do is we're going to avoid this area at least a little bit and talk about the leg. From this point, the major muscle that I see is one of the muscles that very few artists really even consider or oftentimes don't even know, and that's the peroneus longus. Peroneus longus basically starts right at the head of the fibula, and it climbs on top of the peroneus brevis, which you could see right in here. You could see like the shadows and the light in this area. The tendon of the peroneus longus is not important, so I'm going to just leave the beginning of it, but I'm going to leave it alone. That one actually goes underneath the foot. You're like stepping on it. The tendon of the peroneus brevis is the one that you have to remember because it's so visible and becomes an important part of the visible anatomy. The most amazing thing when you think about Bernini is he worked in marble. I mean, think about this, everybody. Marble. You can't erase, you can't Cintiq, you can't Photoshop marble. So when he puts a tendon in or he puts a muscle, he has to know anatomy so completely. Whether it's him, Carpo, or Michelangelo, any of these great artists that lived through the centuries had to know anatomy so completely that you had to feel that there was a skeleton inside that piece of art, whether it's a painting, a drawing, and especially, I think, sculpture. So when I look at this, I see not only a good sculpture, I see something that's actually magnificent. The leg muscles I break up into 6 muscles, the 6 essential muscles of the leg. You're going to find that most of us artistic anatomists always edit. There's over 600 muscles of your body. You're not going to have to know each one of them. If you get the basic like 40, 45 muscles, not including the facial muscles, you're going to find that no matter what point of view you have the model or your drawing, you're only going to see about 42, 43, 44 essential superficial muscles, the ones that push up against the skin. And in this case, you could actually see it. This is a soleus right in here. That's a soleus. This is a gastrocnemius. Maybe I could just kind of put little S's or little. That's a soleus. Later on, we're going to make this clearer. And the gastrocnemius, or your calf muscles, this is specifically as your lateral head, is actually attached to your femur, and it disappears into that little area right there. You can see that it creates a contour, the contour of the leg, and it's pushed up against the soleus. And the soleus actually reaches all the way up to the head of the fibula. Right there. So this whole area is soleus. And the gastrocnemius and the soleus share the Achilles tendon, which takes you down to the heel. So that's basically it. The front now has the extensor digitorum, which does this until it hits the foot. There's these things called retinaculum, which are basically, fancy words for like straps that hold your tendons down. And that's what keeps this from flying off to your toes. At this point, the extensor digitorum, or informally, I'm just going to call him Ed, does that. Okay, it goes to the four toes, not your big toe. You have another tendon that is called the extensor hallucis longus that pulls up on your big toe. So I'm going to leave that one alone. I'm going to make sure that you could see these tendons though. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Right there. And that's the extensor digitorum. It's even telling you what it is. And that is squeezed in. Now, oftentimes, you're not going to see this on your model. What you're going to see is a combined form that pairs up with this one. This is the tibialis anterior. And what you will see, though, is the change of direction right over here. The change of direction of that foot, because it's a tendon. I'm going to hollow this out because those two tendons create a hollow. The tibialis anterior is this muscle right here that creates this nice big form, and it is a contour muscle. The muscle basically ends there, then the tendon takes over, where I'm not going to draw any more form lines. The extensor digitorum, just to kind of review, does this, but remember that overall, when you look at a person, it actually creates one form. So I'm going to make another set of form lines. They're a little bit bigger, and they jump across both. Just to remind you that for the most part, these almost look like one muscle. The peroneus longus is very visible, but the tendon is not. On the one underneath it, so I'm going to put little dots where the tendon would be. On the bottom one, underneath, it's the peroneus brevis. And that one, the muscle kind of disappears, but what's really important about that one is this tendon right here. And it goes to that tuberosity, that little bump on the side of your foot. Tuberosity of fifth metatarsal. This is going to write fifth before we get to the labeling. Gastrocnemius and soleus. So you can see how they're paired up. You have the front two, the tibialis anterior and extensor digitorum. You have the side, which are climbing right on top of each other, peroneus longus, peroneus brevis, and then the back two, soleus, gastrocnemius. Those are 6 muscles essential to knowing this area. Just really quickly, I want to show you how beautifully he drew not only the iliotibial band, but this little S shape is created by two forms. The iliotibial band, which I'll talk about, and the vastus lateralis, which you could see bunching up right there. The patellar ligament, tibial tuberosity. That's it for that image. Same thing with this Bernini. What we have, let's kind of review very quickly, is the head of the fibula, peroneus longus, peroneus brevis. This little indentation right there always tells you, if you take that little arrow, that spot, and just go all the way to the head of the fibula, guess what you have? You instantly have soleus gastrocnemius. That's one of the best things I could teach you right now, very quickly, very easily. The peroneus brevis has a tendon, disappears from this point of view, and it comes out here because it's all foreshortened. This is the bone right there. This was the most important part of this particular point of view. The area here is all tibialis anterior, and the tendon goes to the arch of the foot. So I'm going to draw the foot right over here just to make sure you can see that it's on the arch of the foot. And along with the extensor digitorum, which does this, and you can see the little shadow there, and then the tendon to go to the toes, they split here, but up here they look like one form. Just to remind you that it is two muscles. So if you really want me to split them, I will. There, tibialis anterior, extensor digitorum. There's this little funny area here for the peroneus tertius. That's not, and it's also attached to the tuberosity. In this image, one of the things I really liked about this was the shoulder area. And this is like a really complicated little area of the arm and the shoulder muscles. Okay, so with this beautiful image, this is Del Sarto. Andrea Del Sarto was just a magnificent artist in the 1500s. And some of the things to look for are something like this. This is the spine of the scapula. That one little area, okay? It's like it creates a little plateau. And the neat thing about that is at the very end, I know this is very simplistic because it's just like a little line, but that's the way I want to teach you, is the acromion process of the scapula. Now, over here you see a little dimple, and that's created by basically the ball of the humerus kind of popping through a little bit. One of the things that you'll also see is a little bit of a bulge here. That's actually still deltoid. The deltoid is over here. It ends here at the deltoid tuberosity, halfway down the humerus. And it wraps around to the front where you can't see the clavicle, but the clavicle is in fact attached to the acromion process. And the clavicle looks basically like tricycle handlebars. So I'm going to draw the little handlebars in here. I'm drawing through a lot of imagery. And then this one, of course, is foreshortened. But do you see the little bicycle handlebars? If I were to put the sternum, it would start looking like you're looking at a tricycle. Remember that, because, again, that's another one of my helpful hints. There's usually a bump right there, when you see a person straight on. But it's important to locate some of these things because this deltoid, the shoulder muscle, is attached to the clavicle. But you could see that in this case, the deltoid overlaps and it bulges over that area like this. This bulge over here is where the deltoid is attached to the underneath side of the spine of the scapula. But the part that you really see is this right in here. This little area right here, and you can see how it ends. And it's attached to the same area where the brachialis will be, right in here. And you can definitely see the triceps coming back like this. Okay, those are the triceps split. This is the lateral head of the tricep. This is the long head. And the long head goes into the body looking for and finding the scapula. What you see in the original is you could see like the folds of skin and subcutaneous fat. But what I'm drawing is what the muscle's doing underneath that subcutaneous fat. The other thing to really look for is the bottom part of the scapula. I'm just going to put a dot right here because I see all this bulging. But the bulging can be kind of confusing. One of the first muscles I really want to showcase is this one. This is the teres major, which happens to be one of my favorite muscles. As an anatomist, you'll find that every anatomist has favorite muscles. Mine is that teres major and serratus anterior as well. But that muscle is attached to the bottom part of your scapula, and it goes underneath your arm, and it's attached to the front of the humerus. But what you need to remember is that it's always looking like it's going under the arm. And later on, when we look at the underarm view, you'll see it from the front point of view, from the view of the front of the body. Over here, I want to just draw the bicep because that's a muscle that you guys didn't need me to tell you. So this is bicep right in here. It's nice and tubular. But the muscle that most people don't know is the one that's in here. It's in between the triceps and the biceps. And it disappears like that. And that's the brachialis. Brachialis. Remember, anything with brachii in it, brachii means arm in Greek. So you'll see that a lot. Triceps brachii, biceps brachii, brachialis, brachioradialis, coracobrachialis, brachius, brachium. So all that means is arm. Now there's a muscle that you're not going to see on most humans, and that is the teres minor. And it's going to disappear like that. It's one of the rotator cuff muscles. It's attached to the head of the humerus. The big one, though, is in this area here. And this is the infraspinatus. Now, it can take on different forms because sometimes it gets bunched up and it can look like it has a furrow down the center. So it might confuse people into thinking that there's two muscles there. These are the bellies or the big forms of the deltoid. Okay, and they tend to, like from this point of view, because the thumb is kind of rotating around like this, you'll notice that this will look like it's twisting. Okay, and it's kind of neat to see this on very lean people, very athletic people, that it's just going to look like it's twisting, like you're taking a towel and wringing it. The long head of the tricep jumps in between this little area where these two muscles kind of gave you a little opening. So you see that. What I'm doing here is I'm putting a shadow from the arm onto the teres major. Like that, just to give it a little bit more oomph. Same thing here, the teres minor would put a little bit of a shadow here. This is if there's no skin on there whatsoever. This shading would look kind of like this, because I'm trying to bounce around some of these forms like this. But the teres minor, that tiny little finger-like muscle, and the infraspinatus basically just create one form. You won't see that teres minor. I'm going to let it kind of become like this little tubular form like this. All of this over here is trapezius and some of the deeper back muscles. This little shape here, though, is pretty important because that is the serratus anterior. And you can always tell where that is because it's always like the drapery underneath the teres major, or you could say it's the drapery of the scapula, whichever one makes you happy. I want to talk a little bit about these arms because they weave into the back so nicely. As you now know, this is the long head of the tricep, and that jumps like this into the body, and it's quite exquisite. As you can see the drapery, this is a nice big muscle. So I'm going to, nice big and round, because that's what teres major means. Teres major means big and round, and sure enough it is. All of these things were named appropriately, whether it's the shape of a muscle or its origin or what it does. It'll tell you something about what it is. Extensor digitorum, which we already talked about, is a good example. It extends the digits or fingers or toes. Over here you have this muscle doing this, kind of creating that bulge. It's got a tail that a lot of times people don't know that when you kind of make a fist or raise a barbell, this little guy can stand out. And it looks like a tendon, but it's not. then there is a hollow here, and I'm going to tell you what that hollow is, because that hollow are the muscles I call the twins, which are the brachioradialis and extensor carpi radialis longus, and you kind of do this. Now, right now, I'm drawing them as if they're one, but it's actually split like that. So this one is the brachioradialis. This one's extensor carpi radialis longus. This one's extensor carpi radialis brevis. And it creates like a little bump right there. Again, you're going to see bumps. Whenever you see a bump like this on the surface, and you see that dip, that usually means that there is a muscle overlapping another. Even if you don't see it, you can look at your own body and see that. This here is a tricep tendon, which is attached to your olecranon, which is a fancy word for your elbow. So all of this is tendon. This is your inconius, which to me looks like a Dorito, and it's tucked right into the twins, like that. Okay, then extensor digitorum, which I draw communally, meaning that there's an extensor digiti minimi, but a lot of times a lot of us anatomists just make it into one big form with 4 tendons that split off into the fingers. You're going to see that that's true with the foot as well. This bump over here is one of my favorite little areas. Those are the pollicis muscles. Abductor pollicis longus, which is that top one. Extensor pollicis brevis, and extensor pollicis longus tendon. And these two right in here create a hollow called the anatomical snuff box. And those are your thumb muscles. This one here is extensor carpi ulnaris. And what you see with Andrea del Sarto is this beautiful tendon. Now, have you guys ever thought about the fact that there's a sartorius muscle, which is called the tailor's muscle, because a sart is a tailor. Well, Andrea del Sarto, his father was a tailor, so that's how he got his name. Andrea del Sarto, son of basically of a tailor. Then this area here is the ulna, and you can see it because there's a big head of it. And some of you, if you look at your arm, you'll see that there's a big head at the very end right there. Now this muscle over here, which is a contour muscle, is the flexor carpi ulnaris. So you can see the tendon kind of splitting right in here, but this is the belly of that muscle right in here. Got it? So I'm going to do this darker because I want to remind you that this darkened line is actually the ulna. And it splits the flexors from all of the extensors. Of the arm. This is a beautiful area, isn't it? Now, for those of you that don't know the work of El Greco, I'm trying to remember his actual name because he's Greek. Domenikos Theotokopoulos. How's that for a name? Now, he lived in Spain, and he's basically part of the Spanish Renaissance. But there was like a lot of kind of negativity towards him. And the Spaniards always reminded him that he's not Spanish, he's Greek. So they called him El Greco. Do not forget, your name is the Greek. So he didn't go by his name, or we don't know him by his real name. We know him as El Greco. It's kind of a funny little story about how he got his name. When you look at this work, you'll notice that it's very irregular. Now, he is a mannerist, and mannerists distinguish themselves by basically kind of crossing past the high Renaissance and the formality of it, and looking at art in a very different way. It's kind of like rock and roll. It's just kind of like obliterating anything that came before and then just creating their own thing. Every generation seems to want to express themselves differently or more uniquely than their parents. And that's always been true, and it's going to be true with all the different art periods. There are art periods because people refuse to sit still. What we found in the High Renaissance is a lot of artists after the High Renaissance thought, well, everything's been done. And every age has this, well, everything's been done. Even in my age, it's like the computer, the Cintiq tablet, all this stuff where it's like, well, everything's been done. But who knows 50 years from now what's going to be going on. So we look at this work and you can see it's definitely not Michelangelo. It's definitely not Leonardo. But the one thing, I just mentioned Michelangelo. Michelangelo lived to be about 88 years old. So he lived a long time. He actually transcended his period and it's almost like being a musician and going from one period and crossing over to another because he lived long enough and he composed. So what you see here is kind of like a pushing aside of the High Renaissance ideals and formalism and going a little bit more emotional, not being so stuck with compositional dogma and the pyramid composition, any of that, and there's more fluidity and more emotional content. It's more dramatic. It's not good or bad, it's just different. And this was the precursor also to Baroque. You notice that everything on this painting is kind of pinched at the joints. So if you look at the wrist, you'll notice it's pinched. If you look at the elbow, it's pinched. It's pinched. That's a very incredibly important part of, like, whether they knew it or not, of creating this almost like uncomfortableness. So you could see that everything is kind of like bulging out from that little area. But one of the things that you're going to notice that they still have the anatomy. You can see what's called the infraclavicular notch, which is basically like if you look at a cadaver, it's a hole in between the deltoid and the pectoralis major. You can see the pectoralis major clavicular form, which basically stretches across the chest like that, and then the sternal portion. Now this end here where my little lines are ending, that's basically where the pectoralis major is attached to the center of the body, believe it or not, by a sheet of tendon. But over here, where I'm going to draw it a little bit more in bundles, it is attached to the sternum. Therefore, you see these like stretches of both bone and muscle going across, almost like fingers. So the area over here with all the little ends is actually attached to the center of the body by an aponeurosis. And aponeurosis is a fancy word for flat sheet-like tendon. It's kind of like taking out saran wrap, but imagine if it was made out of tendon. So it stretches across like this, all the way across, like that, as well as the external oblique. The external oblique is also attached to that aponeurosis, and it covers up the abdominal muscles. But you can see some of the same things we've been talking about with other masters, but in this case, it's just an exaggeration of forms. You can still see the peroneal muscles, peroneus longus, peroneus brevis, tuberosity, fifth metatarsal, extensor digitorum, tibialis anterior combined. Remember that dip? You take that to the head of the fibula, and you have yourself a nice oversized soleus, Achilles tendon, and gastrocnemius. Fabulous piece. This particular image is an unknown artist, I'm afraid. I found this and really needed to show it to you. At some point, we're going to just keep searching, but in some cases, there's a lot of art. You'd be surprised. There's so many musicians, artists, writers that are just top-notch, and they're anonymous, and they're anonymous through the ages. And this is one of them. I believe this would be at the same time as Del Sarto. But it could also be grooves. It could be 1700s, 1600s. To my eye, it does look like it's 1600s. Regardless, it's a magnificent piece of anatomy. And for anatomists like myself, there's just nothing better than look at something like this. There's so many places I can go with this, I'm not even sure where to start. But what I'll do is I'll start with the shoulder muscles. All right, so first thing you look at is this whole area over here. And one of the telltale signs I look for is like that dip. Because I know that this trapezius, and that's what that is, this is a trapezius and it's bulging up because he's a well-muscled man and his shoulder is up and he's got force over here. This is force. Okay, so he's kind of holding up the weight of his arms, and that makes muscles contract. So with somebody with a well-built body, you're going to see that that trapezius just jumps. So it creates that bulging in that area. This is a sternocleidomastoideus, because you can see a little bit of the shading right in that little area. It splits, and it's attached to the clavicle, which is not seen here. These are the deeper muscles like the levator scapulae and scalene muscles. But I'm going to kind of keep this a little bit darker because for the most part, you're not going to see those very clearly. Sometimes you do, but I'm going to kind of shade them in just to remind you that the important muscle is the trapezius and sternocleidomastoideus right in here. Okay, that's just for starters. This will remind me, this dip that I was pointing to, will remind you that there's something different there. Remember what I told you? If you see anything like that, that means two muscles. There's two forms. There's something going on. And that is the deltoid. And this is also part of the deltoid. It just wraps around to the back part of the spine of the scapula. All of this is bulging around because underneath there's this like hidden ball. It's almost like if you're making your bed and you threw like a golf ball in your bed and then you make your bed, you could still see the golf ball. Well, in this case, that golf ball is the head of the humerus. And you can see that the shading is so masterful because it's very subtle. It does this and then it changes direction like that. I may be exaggerating, but it just reminds you of how brilliant some of these drawings are. That's why I'd rather look at artwork rather than photographs of models when it comes to like this kind of dissection. The deltoid tuberosity is right there where I put that little dot. That's important to remember because so many things are going to relate to that point. The other thing that he did so well here is that he's pulling, you can see the tension of these muscles. And you know what? I just caught myself saying he. I'm assuming it's a he. It's an unknown artist. So I should leave it at that. He or she is pulling these muscles. But traditionally, unfortunately, the arts weren't always available to women. So that's why there's so few really well-known drawings by women through the ages. It's just not something that they were involved in. It's just a cultural thing. It's not anything else. It's not that they weren't good or anything like that or aren't. It's just a kind of a bias that was held against them. You know, it's kind of like a lot of things that they couldn't do or wasn't a traditional woman's thing to do. Being a goldsmith, a blacksmith, same thing. Almost always they're going to be men. The muscle I want to remind you of is my favorite muscle, teres major. In this case, I didn't have to shadow it. She did it for me. This particular artist is actually using cast shadows to describe the form. Isn't that exquisite? Because in that cast shadow is explaining the latissimus dorsi as he goes under the arm, following its little buddy, the teres major. The infraspinatus is creating that other bump right there. The long head of the tricep is splitting the teres minor and the infraspinatus. Remember, the teres minor is one of these muscles that, you could just throw out. You don't need to memorize that. It's the infraspinatus that you should know. And from this point of view, it kind of like changes form because it's going around. This one's doing this, and it changes direction. It starts going this way underneath the arm. I want you to be able to see that there's a little split right in here, so you can see that the tricep long head is finding that split. And when you see somebody that knows what they're doing, like this particular artist, it's amazing how, wow, it's very clear. No wonder Ray has such an easy job. Is that all I'm doing is tracing over their muscles, for God's sakes. So it's very humbling to see this kind of caliber of anatomical knowledge that was passed on to me by my anatomy teacher. And I pass on to my students, and so on and so forth. That's how we got this information. That's how we keep it alive. And now I'm giving it to you. The bicep is in front, and then you can see a straightening, just to remind you, that's tendon. And then this is that brachialis muscle. But splitting, see, splitting are the twins, brachioradialis, extensor carpi radialis longus. Those are the ones that kind of create that hollow that is very recognizable on your models. The split is somewhere around here. Then you have the extensor carpi radialis brevis and the pollicis muscles. The little bump right here is the anconeus. Then we have all the other muscles of the arm. The ones I want to point out right now, though, are the serratus anterior. You can see the little fingers poking through like toes from underneath the covers, and the interlace with the external oblique muscles, which you can see a little bit of them right there, a little bit of them right there. And the external oblique, once you are clear of the attachments to ribs, becomes the flank portion of your external oblique, which overlaps your ilium. Okay, just lays right on top of it. The rectus abdominis muscles are bouncing in and out of that subcutaneous fat, so I'm not going to draw them. The twins are following the thumb because the thumb is, in fact, rotating away from us. So wherever the thumb goes, these muscles follow. Do you see that? They're jumping over to the other side. This is extensor carpi radialis brevis. Then this is extensor digitorum, this big guy right there. And it splits into 4 tendons. Okay? This one is the one, as I said before, the pollicis muscles, they go to the thumb. That, along with the tendon, the little random tendon of the extensor pollicis longus, create the anatomical snuff box. This little area now is reserved for the extensor carpi ulnaris. It's always easy to remember because it has ulna in the name, as well as the flexor carpi ulnaris. It also has ulna in its name because both of them border. It's like, New Mexico borders Mexico. Kind of makes sense. There, like that. So these are those beautiful muscles. Extensor carpi ulnaris, flexor carpi ulnaris, extensor digitorum. That one's easy because it's the one that goes right to your fingers and extends them. There, like that. Neat image. You can see the great trochanter kind of pushing here. This is actually the tensor fascia, vastus lateralis, biceps femoris long head, gluteus maximus, gluteus medius. Remember, wherever there's a dip, that means that there's 2 forms. In this case, it's gluteus medius, gluteus maximus. Isn't that amazing? So it's becoming kind of like something that is highly manageable. the tensor fascia can bulge out quite a bit like this from this point of view, tensor fascia. There's a dip there because this is soleus, this is gastrocnemius. Gastrocnemius, soleus. Patella is popping out, creating that highlight. This outside border does that. Tibia is poking out. Patellar ligament. So this is all patella, patellar ligament. Voila. This is a vastus medialis, which always kind of like pops up like this, creating a slant to the knee. Which is funny because the actual bone is higher on the outside, like this. But because of that muscle, see on the bone it's like this, but when it's muscled, then it's like this. Remember that. And then here's the patella, just so you know where I'm at. And patellar ligament. Or the ice cream cone. Do you see the ice cream cone? Or the elephant without ears? There. Like that. Okay, this is a canini. And this is a nice little torso. Now, it's kind of light, but we could actually pull some things out of here. They're really quite stunning. Over here, you can see the end of the clavicle as it meets up with the acromion process. This is the acromion process, which I've already talked about. Remember the tricycle? That's this right in here. That's the handlebars of that tricycle. So the clavicle is here on the left, his left side. You could see the beginning of the other clavicle, but it disappears because of all the flesh. You can see a little bit of the shadow there. That's how I found it. And the sternocleidomastoideus is what creates that little hollow right there because it's basically the suprasternal notch. So it's in between each clavicle and the sternum. Okay, so this is a clavicle kind of disappearing, going up over there, over here. It's in this area. So I'm going to put just the beginnings of these clavicles right there. And they're going to create a bump here, so you can see that nice bump. And another one. Now, this one I learned from studying Leonardo because he always mentions, almost as if he's talking to us through the ages, to put those two little bumps there. Then the deltoid goes around the ball of the humerus, and then the belly of the muscle bounces across like that. So even though I told you that those are two muscles, whenever you see a dip, in this case, it's two forms of the same muscle. It's this muscle going around the ball of the humerus there, but the belly of the muscle does this, and you can see where canini ends that muscle right there. Now, getting to the chest, there's an area here that you can see this triangle, which is really, really nice because it makes it easy for me to explain to you with Canini's help that there's kind of like this void of muscle in between both of the chest muscles right there, the pectoral muscles. And you'll see this on a lot of guys, a lot of the male models. It's a really kind of a neat little area to remember to leave alone. You'll see a little bit of a hollow here, and that's okay because that's the infraclavicular fossa. You would see a little bit more of it here. If you could take out the skin, you would see that there's a hole here that separates the deltoid muscle, which you could see by the shading and light. There's light and shadow there. The forms have shadows going like this. And it signifies that this is a pectoral muscle. You can see the edge of the pectoral muscle in like this, and it follows the deltoid going like this, but it's tucked underneath it. There is a very, very subtle shadow here. You might not even see it, but my eyes see all this stuff. And that is the pectoralis major clavicular portion. The rest of this expanse is the sternal portion. There is a pectoralis minor, but it's underneath. There's also even a pectoralis major abdominal portion, which is like right below the nipple. Sometimes you'll see a little form below the nipple, below the chest, below the nipple, and that's what that is. But in this case, the muscle fibers end abruptly right in here, right in here, right in this little area, creating almost like the stair step. But the actual muscle, as I told you already, is attached to an aponeurosis, which spans across, and along with the external oblique is attached to the center of the body. That's just something that not too many people know, but it's in fact true. And you'll see that, like when I work with cadavers, you could actually see that. You could actually see the layers. The rectus abdominis creates this nice little border. This is the anterior superior iliac spine, which gives away the position of the pelvis. Same as here. I'm going to move it just slightly from what Canini gave me, but you can actually see the form right in there. And because of that, it's kind of neat because there's a ligament that kind of separates the abdominal area from, or the torso from the lower limbs. This is tensor fascia, and tensor fascia is here. And the sartorius creates that shadow. And sometimes you can even see a hollow here on some of the models. That's because of those two muscles. If the person's lean enough, and the sartorius does this, it's a big muscle, longest muscle of the body, separating the quadriceps from the adductors. There's subcutaneous fat that's being held up by a strap, which creates this little holder right there. The rectus abdominis does this, and it actually originates at the fifth rib, which is also where the nipple is. The rectus abdominis is underneath the pectoral muscles, and it's a sheet of muscle that does that. And you can see a lot of the tendinous intersections. And the other thing you're going to see is basically this. I'm going to make these a little bit more stretched out the way he has them. Sometimes, there's a lot of almost liberties taken by artists. I'm just going to kind of scribble these in until I could find a little bit more of where the placement is on this particular artist's work. Okay, so those are the six-pack groups. Now, they disappear underneath the pectoral muscles. So they're tucked in underneath there. Okay, but usually what you'll see is you'll see little shading. I'm going to make it darker so you can really see it. But the other thing to remember is that you could still see the shading of the rib cage all along here. Now you have to remember, this is kind of like an exaggerate. This is an ideal form. They're not depicting real people. And the reason what happens is this, historically. And I thought about this a lot, and I pass this on to my students. When I was a young student and learning all about, the Greek sculptures and the Kouros boys and things like that, I often look at something like a Hercules or something like that from Greek mythology, and why did these things look so cool to me? And later on, when I was even a younger boy, I should say, even before art school, I had all my Marvel comics and DC comics and Captain America and all that, and I tried to discern what was going on. It was just overwhelming. Then later on, when I was in college and studying the old masters and even antiquity, I wondered what it is that made these drawings look so much better than the stuff I was doing in class. And it finally hit me, and I was able to explain it. A lot of times what you're seeing, and I tell my students to do this, when they have the model in front of them, the model, because he or she is a living, breathing human being, they're oftentimes adjusting their weight, 15, 20 minutes in. It's not easy, right? They take a breath, you can see the rib cage. They shrug, they kind of adjust their shoulders a little bit, kind of loosen up their necks. I tell my students this is a perfect time to really study because their muscles are contracted, they're they're tense. They're trying to catch their weight, and all of a sudden their peroneus longus or peroneus brevis or other muscles kind of pop out. I go, those are the muscles you put in at that moment. Later on, it hit me. It's like, that's it. That's the answer. If you could picture anything like a heroic figure from early Greek art, all the muscles are contracted but in a very relaxed pose. So you can imagine just kind of like being super relaxed and almost asleep, but every one of your muscles is contracted as if you were making a muscle to show off your biceps. That was the key. It's like there was that contradiction that can't happen in real life. You can't have a model tensing up every single muscle in their body and still look relaxed. So if you could do that, both of those things, that's art. And that's interpretive art. And that's interpreting reality, but making it more idealized and better and more personal. So that's the key. So I look at something like this or other pieces of art, I think about that. And when you look at this, honestly, it's not a real looking person. To me, it looks better because it's interpreted by great artists. What you'll see is you see shading, and the shading kind of represents things. So in this case, you have the rib cage underneath, forms are flowing over it like water over rocks. So you need to remember that even though you have forms, I call it, write this down because you're going to like this, transparency of form. That is form on top of form. It's like a messy bed. It's not the top layer. It's the top layer plus the bottom layers. All those layers add. That's why sometimes you can have the top layer smooth, but it's not smooth because there's something that's folded over underneath. That's a transparency of form. That's a form on top of a form, on top of a form, on top of a form. So what you see here is transparencies of form. And there's bones, and there's muscles, and there's fat, and there's one side is contracted, and the other side is stretched. So this side is stretched over here, and it creates this dynamic pose. And this side over here, it's compressed, so it's like an accordion, and everything folds up right over here. And that's when you get into some really beautiful, beautiful art. This line is very important because it's a pectoralis major as it blends in with the deltoid. So over here, the pectoralis major ends. And remember, the muscle fibers end, but they're attached to the center of the body by an aponeurosis. So they end abruptly. That's why it looks so much like they're attached to the ribs. But over here, they are attached to skeleton because they're sternum. So when I draw it darker, it's where it's attached to the sternum. And then don't forget that there's a pectoralis major clavicular portion as well, which is higher. But in this case, it gets kind of like obscured by the fact that there's this big old deltoid that is looking for its attachment point, which is at the side of the arm, which is why all of this will look like it's twisting and pulling. You'll see all this. Here's another rule of thumb. This is something that when I teach animal anatomy that's very clear. This is the clavicle, and I'm drawing it even though on an arm that's up, it's going to be obscured. I'm still going to draw it because where the deltoid ends here on the clavicle, if you just jump over to the other side of that clavicle, that is always where you find your trapezius. Because on animals, this is one fluent muscle with only connective tissue like gristle on a steak separating the two. So we see the deltoid, and this deltoid, remember, wraps around to the back. So that's why what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw deltoid on the back, trapezius in between, and deltoid on the front. That's why as you raise your arm, it gets more and more puckered. I know that's not exactly the way he drew it. It's the way I'm drawing it. So I'm interpreting the interpreter. The sternocleidomastoideus will create this area here with a little fossa, anterior fossa, posterior triangular fossa. It's here. So there's two dips. A fossa is just a fancy word for a dent or an indentation. In this case, I'm going to make a really supersized sternocleidomastoideus. The jawline is actually here. Adam's apple's here, and here's the canopy underneath The chin, which is, if you really wanted to look at what creates that, there's a digastric muscle. It goes from the chin to the hyoid bone, which is the bone where your tongue is attached, and it goes up to the mastoid process, which is a big bump behind your ear. If you could see through this, his ear would be around here, so there's a bump right back here. And this line goes right to that. There, by way of that one little stop right here. So when you put the jawline in, it creates that little beautiful area underneath there. The other thing I want to throw in, even though it's not very visible, is I'm going to make this very simple line going across like that, because that's how I find where the serratus anterior muscles will end up, like that. And those are the little finger-like muscles. The external oblique interlaces with them like this until they become the flank portion of the external oblique. And that's what you see in this little bubble right in here. So I basically liken these to like slats on a fence. Do you see the slatted fence? Because they're relatively flat and slat-like. And they're very flat and slat-like, but squishy. So they're going to take on the form of like this, and whatever the body's doing, they kind of follow. Then these are more rounded forms, and they're underneath the latissimus dorsi. The latissimus dorsi is this big bubble around here. And if you were to take off the skin, you would see that the serratus anterior actually goes all the way up, but there's no way you're going to see this on any living person. Basically, what you're going to see is 4, maybe 5 of these fingers on the living form. Michelangelo tends to draw more of these on the actual surface, but that's because he's Michelangelo. He's kind of like Jimi Hendrix on the guitar. He's like that when he draws. So you'll see that these fingers are more rounded. They're like big and bulbous, interlacing with the flatness of the serratus anterior and the flatness of the external oblique. I'm going to make these a little darker so you can really see them. And the external oblique is actually attached to a few ribs down below, just right at the bottom, as well as the latissimus dorsi, believe it or not. That's why sometimes you'll see actually a tubular form along the edge of the latissimus dorsi, because part of it is locked into the rib cage. Nobody's going to know this but us, you and me, but that's the teres major right there. Teres major. See a little bit of it right there. And coracobrachialis. Since he drew it, I might as well explain it. There's a coracobrachialis, and that is part of the tricep medial head, and this is the tricep long head. And this would continue up like that. And this is called the axilla. The armpit. This creates a rhythm line that's really quite exquisite. The deltoid, which ends here, as you know, and it tucks in with the pectoralis major is tucked in there. So all of a sudden you end up with something that looks like that. How's that for gorgeous? This is a flank portion of the external oblique, but still the same muscle. Don't forget. All of this stuff, I want you, the next time you're at a figure drawing workshop, please look for all this stuff, because you don't have to just look at heroic pieces of art. You can make heroic pieces of art using your models.